Hi there, smart drivers. Rick with Smart Drive Test talking today about the Textalyzer. The Textalyzer is proposed legislation in New York State that would give police the ability and the tools to determine if you are texting and driving. The Textalyzer, if is passed into law in New York State, will catch on like wildfire, absolutely no doubt. The GDL program, the Graduated Drivers Licensing Program that was passed in 1987 in New Zealand, saw the same thing, caught on like wildfire. By the beginning of the 2000s, every state and province in the G20 nations had a GDL program in place, as well as hands-free cell phones. Most of the states in the United States have hands-free legislation, and Canada and other industrialized countries in the world also have hands-free legislation and laws that prevent you from using a handheld cell phone. I'm going to argue in this video that it is not going to be proposed legislation and laws and greater enforcement that are going to deter distracted driving, as it's called. And I'm also going to talk about definitions of distracted driving, because I don't believe that talking on a cell phone and all of the other things that can cause you to be distracted during driving are one and the same thing. I believe that distracted driving and talking on your phone or using your phone to browse the internet or social media sites is something different, in a very different category. So I'm going to argue that in fact it's not going to be laws and education and changing people's behavior that's going to reduce the amount of distracted driving on our roadways, but rather it's going to be engineering and other technological advancements that's going to change distracted driving and drivers' behavior in terms of keeping us safe on our roadways. We'll be right back to talk to you about that. Hi there, smart drivers. Welcome back. Rick talking to you today about the Textalyzer. And the Textalyzer moves to reduce distracted driving by giving police tools and increased powers to determine whether you are texting or using your cell phone while driving. So the first thing I want to do is I want to talk about distracted driving. And I have a little bit of difficulty with the definition of distracted driving and lumping the use of cell phones into distracted driving, because I think using a cell phone and driving is a very different category from all of the other things. You know, listening to music, using your GPS, eating, putting on mascara, shaving, all of those things are distracted driving. Yes, you're distracted, but I think that talking on your cell phone is something very different. The other thing that is problematic in terms of distracted driving and using your phone while driving is the parallel between the Textalyzer and the breathalyzer. And there's absolutely no coincidence in the fact that authorities and other interested parties that are pushing to get the Textalyzer in place are making a direct parallel between drinking and driving and texting and driving. And those two things, in terms of what happens to the human body, are completely different. You are inebriated when you are drunk. Your ability to perform physical functions and mental and cognitive functions is reduced when you drink alcohol. When you are driving and texting, many people are under the false assumption that they can multitask and do two things at one time, when the reality is that we as human beings cannot multitask. It has been shown by psychology that human beings have the inability, that in other words, they cannot, in fact, multitask. It's like our vision. We can't look at more than one thing at a time. We have a central vision and we have peripheral vision. For most of us as adults at 180 degrees, our peripheral vision is attracted to light and movement. And when we are attracted to light and movement and we move to look at it, to focus in on something, for example, it's our central vision. And our central vision is only about that much at arm's length. It's not very big of a space at all. And our ability to focus in on one task cognitively is the same thing when we're driving. We cannot focus on a phone call, we cannot focus on looking on the internet or texting or whatnot and concentrate on the task of driving. So texting and driving and drinking and driving are two different things in terms of what happens to the body. But the reason that authorities are drawing a parallel between drinking and driving and texting and driving is because they want the same consequences. If you get pulled over and police are granted the authority, the increased police powers of being able to use the textilizer, legislators and other authorities want to give police the same powers that they have for drinking and driving. And those same police powers are, if you refuse to give your cell phone to police, you have implied consent by the fact that your license is a privilege. And in having a license and having that privilege, you have implied consent. When you sign the back of your license, you are giving authorities, the government, implied consent that you will consent to a breathalyzer, you will consent to a textilizer. So the parallel between drinking and driving and texting and driving, there is absolutely no mistake about what authorities are doing, and that is the reason that they're doing it. In the United States, the National Highway Traffic Safety Association has indicated that distracted driving is becoming an epidemic problem. As well, traffic crashes have increased in the last few years by as much as 8%. Now, there is some problem in making that correlation between distracted driving and increased traffic crashes, because in the last couple of years, fuel prices have been down, and because fuel prices have been down, people have been driving more. So that could possibly be one explanation for the increase in crashes. Now, I'm not negating the fact that distracted driving is problematic. There was a study done by the AAA, the American Automobile Association, 3 or 4 years ago that indicated that 66% of Americans admitted to talking on their phone while driving, and 33% of Americans, 1/3 of the American population, 100 million people, admitted to texting and driving. So no doubt, using a cell phone, using a smartphone and driving is becoming an increasing problem. The 3 tiers of traffic safety are engineering, education, and enforcement. And what we have been trying to do with hands-free cell phones, the first thing we have done is education and enforcement. We have passed laws to ban the use of hands-free cell phones. We've also given increased police powers to police that. GDL programs, graduated driver licensing programs, have banned the use of both hands-free phones and handheld phones for new drivers. So new drivers can't use either or in terms of cell phones while driving. Basically, what we have been trying to do in terms of education and enforcement is trying to influence people's behavior while driving. Influencing people's behavior while driving is an incredibly difficult task. In terms of trying to influence people's decision-making process on any given day, in any given mood, in any given situation, it is a huge problem, because you're trying to influence hundreds of millions of people's decision-making processes in any given situation. So enforcement and education have not been as successful as authorities would like us to believe. And as the attempts to influence people's behaviors becomes less and less successful, the carrot and the stick becomes bigger and bigger. Thus, the proposed legislation for the textilizer. And if the textilizer is passed in New York State, as I said in the introduction, this is just going to have a snowball effect where most of the states in the US, most of the provinces in Canada, and other industrialized countries in the world are going to adapt the textilizer to try and control people using their phones while driving. The other thing that's problematic about phones and cell phones is that the historical use of phones. When phones for the last century have been bolted down in our houses. We have used phones in our private space of our house. Phones obviously evolved in the 90s and into the early 2000s. We got cordless phones and we could move around our houses and whatnot, and then we got the first cell phones. The first cell phones actually, believe it or not, were developed as car phones. They were actually intended to be used in our cars. And so we have this historical idea that phones are part of our house, part of our personal space, and cell phones were used in cars. And the middle class tried to emulate the upper socioeconomic bracket of society, and it was those people who had the first cell phones, the first car phones. So the middle class obviously emulated to get car phones themselves because it was a symbol of wealth. And the same thing that a few years ago, my parents' generation, the baby boomers all drove Cadillacs. It was a symbol, it was an outward symbol of economic wealth. as was the first car phone. So we have these two things where phones are bolted down in our houses and we use them as a private space, and then the first cell phones are developed as actual car phones. Now, our car as well, talking about phones being used in personal spaces, our car is a very personal space, and we use our phones in personal spaces because driving becomes a secondary task. We look for activities to engage us, to keep us occupied, using our phone, browsing our internet, taking selfies, being on social media. All this keeps us entertained while doing the secondary task of driving. And we do that in our private spaces. We talk on phones in our private spaces. Think of the social stigma that we now have attached to cell phones if you're talking on a phone in a public queue. Everybody's got that look while they're trying to talk on their phone and they're in a public place. This is the reason that texting has become so popular, because texting is private. It's only between you and the person who's on the other end of that text. You can be standing in the same room and texting somebody, and somebody else in the same room will not know. However, if you're on your phone, people know. So on that point of using phones in private spaces, and the first cell phones developed as car phones, it's not surprising that cell phones have evolved where we use them in our cars, because a car is a private space, and the first cell phones were developed as car phones. Therefore, we use them in our cars, because since the motor car was developed and we have become adept at driving motor cars, after you get some experience, driving a car is a very secondary activity, and we find all kinds of other things to do in our cars to occupy the time, to pass the time. Phones evolved in the private spaces of our houses. The first phones developed as car phones, and now phones are not phones. And I think the other problem with phones, and the reason that we have a problem with this, with using cell phones while driving, is because we have this association with phones. It is not a phone anymore. It is a computer. I can do everything on my phone that I can do on my computer at my desk. I can browse the internet, I can watch videos, I can text, I can type. The only difference between my phone and an actual computer is that it is smaller screen, and I don't have a keyboard on my phone. So we need to change the language of smartphones, of iPhones and Android phones to have these as portable computers and to label them for what they actually are. I believe that if we're able to change the language of phones to computers, or some other word that is synonymous with computer, that will begin to change the epidemic of using cell phones while driving. The other social movement that is moving to change distracted driving is the Grassroots movement that is coming out of parents who have lost teenage children in crashes where other people were inebriated, other people were talking on their cell phones. And this began in 1980 with Candy Lightner, who lost her 13-year-old daughter Carrie to a drunk driver. She founded MAD and changed an entire culture of drinking and driving in the last 20 years, the last 25 years, and how we perceive drinking and driving, that it has become socially unacceptable to drink and drive. Candy Lightner is also involved in partnerships for distracted free driving and has gone on board with moving to make it socially unacceptable to use your phone while driving. In 2006, Tim Hollister lost his son Reed and took aim at the GDL program, the Graduated Driver's Licensing Program in Connecticut, feeling that it was not strong enough, it did not impose enough restrictions and rules and guidelines for new drivers, and that new drivers were at risk and the government needed to do more and tighten up the GDL program. Vijay Dixit lost his daughter Shreya to a distracted driver and wrote the book One Split Second. Also brought on board authorities and believes that he has proposed solutions to fix the problem. And finally, Ben Lieberman, who began the organization DORC, Distracted Operators Risk Casualties, and the law that is being proposed in New York State for the Textalyzer is for his son Evan, and it's actually being called Evan's Law in memory of Evan, who was sleeping in the backseat of a car and was struck by another vehicle that they believe was using the internet on his phone while driving. This is where enormous pressure is put on the government to tighten up laws, to have programs that distract and dissuade drivers from texting talking on their phones and driving. So these parents that have lost children and are pushing the government to propose tougher laws, tougher regulations, are moving to treat it like drink driving, to make it socially unacceptable, that the breathalyzer and the textilizer are one and the same and have the same consequences, that people give implied permission that if they refuse a breathalyzer, they refuse a textilizer, that they can have penalties imposed on them because of their implied consent. Now, these social movements, these laws and enforcement and education are not going to be effective right away. And the example that I use are seatbelt laws that came out in the 1970s. Seatbelt laws were not as effective as they are today until well into the 1990s. And the reason that seatbelt laws were not effective until almost 20 years later was because of the same sort of marketing plan that McDonald's used. McDonald's targeted their marketing towards children. Children pestered their parents to drag them into McDonald's, and it worked. And what happened with seatbelt laws, the same analogy, what happened was that children from the 1970s, 1980s grew up wearing seatbelts, and then finally by the late 1980s and early 1990s were pestering their parents that they too had to wear seatbelts. There were other forces at play. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't just a generational influence that brought seatbelt use to the high 90s by the early 1990s. There were, you know, those annoying buzzers in your car and whatnot that told you you had to wear your seatbelt and whatnot. But for the most part, it was a generational influence. The generation that grew up wearing seatbelts, being strapped into car seats, wearing helmets and those types of things that influenced their parents to wear seatbelts. And the same thing with texting, talking on cell phones and driving. If we're going to be successful to make it socially unacceptable to talk on your phone and drive, we're going to have to start with the beginning of a generation. And the problem is that we now have a generation of people who are growing up the same as the baby boomers who were the first generation to grow up with the motor car. We now have a generation of people who are growing up, and they are the first generation to grow up with a cell phone. Because I'll tell you, I'm a little bit older. I'm not that old, but I didn't get a cell phone until 2 years ago. I held out to the last. So if we're going to have a movement to make it socially unacceptable to use our phones while driving, it's going to have to start at the beginning of a generation. Now, the other problem that governments have is that there is a fundamental conflict between privacy and the government's right to protect society. Those two things are coming at a head. And in the United States, the Supreme Court unanimously decided that phones, our computers, our mini computers, there was privacy, and that police and other authorities could not go into your phone without getting a warrant, and only after they got a warrant did they have access to your cell phone records. All of this is right to privacy, and this is one of the things that is probably going to stall the legislation in New York State, is the Fourth Amendment and the right to privacy. Because the textilizer, if police plug into your phone, some authorities have already indicated that they're not just downloading information about whether you've used your phone or not. They're actually downloading the contents of your phone, and having access to the contents of your phone flies in the face of the Fourth Amendment and other privacy issues. So as I said at the beginning, what I was going to argue in this video was the fact that we are not in fact going to change people's behavior with education and enforcement. We're not going to stop people from texting and driving. We're not going to stop people from talking on their phones, because people would rather have a traffic violation than they would for being late or not communicating with somebody that they're going to meet them somewhere else, or they need to pick up groceries, or whatever the conversation is that we're having with somebody else. And it's the same thing with speeding. Many people will speed rather than be late for an appointment, because many traffic violations are seen like tax fraud or tax evasion. It's a victimless crime. Nobody gets hurt unless there's a crash. And many people, when they drive, are optimistic in the fact that they're not going to get into a crash. They're not going to get a violation. They're not going to get caught by police. Statistics have shown that most people who drive in cars only get into a crash once every 14 years. So most people do not think of their vehicles as being dangerous. It's impossible to sort of think of our vehicles as being dangerous, because the risk of a crash happening is minute for most people. The other proposed solution is autonomous cars, which are beginning to come out as a bit of a novelty in terms of the Google car that drives around without somebody in it. They are autonomous, but the thing is that yes, I'm all for bringing on the autonomous car. I am looking forward to being transported around in a car that drives itself. The real issue is that system, that network of having autonomous cars driving around our roadways is nowhere in the near future. I see that the autonomous car is at least 50 years off. Not only is the autonomous car at least 50 years off in terms of its technological viability, but also the fact of everybody who's driving around now, what I would label as the traditionalists, who are like, there's no way I'm giving my control over to a machine to drive me around in my car. That is going to come at real conflict with the traditionalists and the futurists of having autonomous cars actually drive us around. So to implement that system is some decades off and is not an immediate solution to distracted driving and talking on our phones while driving. One of the more immediate solutions for talking on our phones while driving and texting and whatnot is better voice recognition, better voice to text software. And if we can implement some of that, this may reduce some of the distracted driving that we now have, and will propose viable solutions for politicians and other people who are called upon to uphold public safety. Just a kind of an interesting study. As you may or may not know from watching some of the videos on my channel, my PhD is in legal history and particularly traffic safety, and I have looked at and studied traffic crashes since the late 1960s until sort of the 2000s, and have found that in fact traffic fatalities have been reduced greatly. However, cars and drivers are still crashing at more or less the same rate as they were in the late 1960s, and injuries are at the same rate. People are surviving car crashes more and more. And all of this is because of seatbelt use, better safety features on vehicles, crumple zones on the front, collapsible steering wheels, padded dashboards, those types of things, better response time to emergency facilities, to hospitals, GPS, being able to locate these locate these injured people and drivers and get them medical attention and whatnot. All of this has served to reduce fatalities. People are living longer and crashing the same. So like the ability to reduce the number of fatalities due to better engineering, better safety features on vehicles and seatbelts and whatnot, the ability to get people to put down their phones and stop texting and talking on their phones while driving is going to be about technological advances, and whether that's autonomous vehicles, better text-to-voice software so that people can talk and give directions to their phones, which is coming on board more and more as smartphones, Androids, iPhones develop. So what's going to happen is it's going to be technology, it's going to be engineering that reduces our talking and driving on phones. In conclusion, argued that education and enforcement are not going to influence drivers' behavior so that they put down their cell phones. They're going to continue to text and drive. The Textalyzer, if that legislation is passed in New York State and becomes law, it will catch on like wildfire. All of the industrialized countries in the world will take that on board, pass it into law, and we will have the Textalyzer and increase police powers that will allow police to plug your phone into software that will determine if you've been using your phone while driving. Now, the proposed legislation in New York State says that they can only do it post-crash. Well, there is a bit problematic because the government has to mediate the conflict between privacy and the public safety, and whichever one of those outweighs the other one will be yet to be seen. But in the United States, you're up against the Fourth Amendment, the right to privacy. The Supreme Court unanimously decided some years ago that authorities, FBI agents, and other people had to get a search warrant to get access to your cell phone records, to get access into your phone. And the company that is on board to develop the Textalyzer software, Cellubrite, was the same company that the FBI used in investigating a suspected terrorist some years ago and cracked the iPhone. The other forces at play are the Grassroots movement with Candy Lightner, Ben Lieberman, Tim Hollister, and Vijay Dixit, who a couple of these have written books, have founded social organizations, MAD, Mother Against Drunk Driving, and DORC, Distracted Operators Risk Casualties. These social movements and these people who have founded these social movements are putting enormous pressure on public authorities to put in place measures that will protect their sons and daughters and young people, because one of the worst things for any parent is to outlive their children. Whether we're going to influence people's behavior in terms of driving on any given day, in any given situation, in any given mood, is not likely going to happen. So what I'm proposing is that better software in voice to text recognition software, so that we can talk and text, and this technology will come about in the next couple of years. It's also been proposed that autonomous cars will reduce crashes due to distracted driving. Autonomous cars, in my firm belief, are a long way off, decades in fact, before we see autonomous cars making huge inroads into driver safety and reducing the number of crashes on our roadways. Question for my smart drivers: do you believe the Textalyzer will help to reduce people using their phones, their smartphones, their computers while driving their car? Leave a comment down in the comment section, join the discussion, see if we can get people to put down their cell phones while they're driving. If you like what you saw here, share, subscribe, leave a comment, all that helps us out. I'm Rick with Smart Drive Test. Thanks very much for watching. Remember, pick the best answer, not necessarily the right answer. Have a great day. Bye now. In the United States, the National Traffic Safety something. Could they make it any longer? National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. In the United States, the National Traffic Highway, is it highway traffic or traffic highway? National Highway. I cannot talk.